Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And we're going to do a book review today. I've had a number of titles sent to me recently, and the first we're going to look at is by a pretty good friend of the Explaining History podcast, Dr. Alex Kay at the Institute of Contemporary History in Berlin. He's had a couple of outstanding titles on Nazi Germany published earlier. Such as Exploitation, Resettlement and Mass Murder, the Political and Economic Planning for German Occupation Policy in the Soviet Union. And he's the co-editor of Nazi Policy on the Eastern Front 1941, Total War, Genocide and Radicalization. So it's no surprise that his next work, The Making of an SS Killer, the life of Colonel Alfred Filbert, focuses on similar topic areas. Now, one of the questions that Alex poses at the start of the book is why it is that there should be yet another title on an SS officer. He makes the point, I guess, with some justification, that the history shelves are kind of groaning in university departments and bookstores under the weight of biographies of Himmler and Heydrich and Eichmann and people like that. But Filbert, the subject of his book, doesn't really move in those circles. He's a far less important figure, but certainly a more hands-on one, somebody who is active in implementing genocide and involved in mass killings during the Second World War. So there are a number of really interesting things to say about this book, and there are a number of reasons why it's definitely worth getting. One of the reasons I like it is that it avoids the kind of the problems that I see in Nazi biographies. You have Nazi biographies generally tend to range from the extremely good, say for example Ian Kershaw's biography of Adolf Hitler, to the abysmally bad and the lurid, the sort of thing you pick up for £1 in a discount bookshop, and they tend to obviously focus, which is unsurprisingly, on the Holocaust. But the rest of the essential biographical, historical biographical work that needs to be done, that in order to make sense of the individual mass killer or the architect of the Holocaust and their times, gets missed out on. A great example of a really beautifully written Nazi biography was a book written by Gita Sereny, I think in the early 1990s, following her interviews with Albert Speer, and it was Albert Speer, his battle with truth. And that creates this wonderfully detailed contextualizing picture around Albert Speer before, during, and after Nazism. And I saw some interesting parallels between that and this book. The kind of the rather banal careerism of both men. Filbert starts out life as reading as something of a kind of an academic and intellectual also-ran, who was desperate to build some kind of career for himself in the 1920s before Nazism. His father had been a corporal in the German army, in the Kaiser army, during the war, promoted to sergeant major, and he had grown up with very sort of strict and stern parents. The book kind of prevents itself from going down the route of psychohistory, which I for one find a kind of fairly dubious practice, in terms of putting the character on the couch and trying to analyse them. But it does say that you have a generation of young men who grew up to join the Nazis, who were all more than likely beaten at home by their parents, and whilst we can't draw any inference from that, we can still have to bear in mind this in itself is not insignificant. Though then again, if that were a determining factor, Nazism would have sprung up probably in nearly every country in the world at that period in time. Anyway, I digress. So Filbert is an interesting character for a number of reasons. He's typical of the interwar generation of young German men who were too young to see action in the war and greatly regret this, and yet embrace Nazism with a zeal that some of the old fighters, some of the war veterans and the Freikorps, even they don't. He was interviewed in 1969 by a British psychoanalyst, Dr. Henry Dix, who said, when talking to Filbert, his was a we response to the social pressures of that time on a young man typically predisposed to identify himself with the Nazi movement, which promised to heal Germany's divisions, hunger, and humiliated soldierly pride, and to realise such men's hate-laden aims, to exterminate its real and imaginary opponents and enemies. So much of Filbert's thinking, his rhetoric, was about the greater collective when he spoke in these terms, and that he, as this post-war generation, possibly needed to be part of a solution to Germany's perceived ills, and this was going to be obviously a racial solution. It's interesting to note that he doesn't join the Nazis until 1932. He joins the SS first and then joins the Nazis the next day. So he's a relative latecomer to the movement, and he's not been one of the guys that has struggled through the party's lean years in the mid-1920s when it really looked as if Nazism was going nowhere at all. And interestingly, he accesses Nazism through university. There's a wealth of stuff written. If you read Richard J. Evans' The Third Reich in Power, and the coming of the Third Reich, in fact, he writes extensively about the influence that Nazi student movements had. And if you look back in German history through to the Second Empire, the Bismarckian and Wilhelmine era, students represent this core body of nationalist reaction, quite unlike the students of the later 20th century who would go radically in the other direction. So Nazism, German universities were great factories for producing future educated and skilled Nazi leadership and alumni. Throughout the book, Filbert is quite an unreliable witness. He has later, at his trial, denied being at certain meetings when particularly crucial aspects of anti-Semitic policy are discussed. Yet later the evidence emerges that he was indeed there. An example of this is the meeting in 1939 with Heydrich and Eichmann, where it was Heydrich orders that, and this was on the 21st of September, so the invasion has already taken place, that Poland's Jews are rounded up into Poland's cities. Jews from the Reich are transported to Poland. The 30,000 gypsies in the Reich are moved to Poland, and that there is a systematic sending forth of the Jews from German territories with freight trains. So Poland was becoming this racial dumping ground, not just for Jews who had been Polish Jews, but were in the Warthegau and East Prussia, which had been assimilated back into the Reich. But there were assimilated German Jews who had been in Germany proper for many generations, who are now being removed to Poland to be ghettoized in Poland's cities. So Filbert said he wasn't at this meeting, but the minutes clearly place him there. And it's the first moment that Filbert connects with policies of deportation and ghettoization. And then by 1941, he is involved in mass killing. Filbert had quite a successful career. Throughout the 1930s, his star rose rapidly. He is subject to quite a telling off from Reinhard Heydrich for the quality of his foreign intelligence reports, apparently newspaper cuttings and things he's cribbed from the radio as opposed to real hard human intelligence. But it doesn't seem to have done his career much harm. His problem really stems from his brother denouncing Hitler, which is quite a career disaster for any aspiring Nazi. And this presents us with clues to Filbert's zeal, that he embraced the cause of Nazism with immense passion in order to prove his allegiance to the New Order, in contrast to that of his brother, who is, by his own political views, an outsider, an other. And it shows that this desire to be accepted, included, and part of the racial tribe, if you will, was extremely strong within Filbert, and amplified really by his brother's arrest and imprisonment. Otto Filbert had been encouraged by Filbert's parents to come back from America, where he'd been working as an engineer in Philadelphia. He came back. He'd been there for 12 years, and so this was his first experience of Nazism in the mid-1930s. He came back in 1938, in fact. And he found Germany a strange and alien place that he couldn't adapt to. He only intended to stay in Germany for a year, and then discovered that Hitler had passed a decree preventing German emigration, and so couldn't leave, and was stuck as a German national. He's enormously resentful about this, and when Georg Elser attempts to assassinate Hitler in November 1939, Elser was a carpenter who installed a bomb into the Biergartenbrau Keller in Munich, and knew that Hitler would be there for the anniversary of the Munich Putsch, and Hitler, by pure chance, escapes with his life. Elser, by pure bad luck, is caught, and the Gestapo first don't believe he could possibly have done it, and they get him to recreate the bomb, and frankly they're amazed. He was going in there every night, hollowing out a pillar in the building, and installed the device. Following that assassination attempt, fatefully, Otto Filbert said to a colleague, "It's a pity that the scoundrel didn't perish." He was arrested by the Gestapo in Magdeburg, and was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment for treachery. He didn't have any previous convictions, and was convicted on the basis of the law against treacherous attacks on state and party, and for the protection of party uniforms. So he was prohibited, the law that prohibited any denunciation of the party or any of its members, and was first sent to regular prison, and then after intervention from Heinrich Himmler, was to be sent directly to a concentration camp. And it does seem to have brought Filbert's advancement in his career grinding to a halt. Otto served 4 years in a prison in Dessau, and in December 1943 he was taken to Buchenwald near Weimar, which by that point was starting to face immense overcrowding. So it goes in January 1944 from having 37,000 inmates to October that year having 85,000. So the potential for disease and contagion and mass death is obviously very strong. Otto Thilbert left Buchenwald before the end of 1944. He was released from the main concentration camp on the 20th of October and was transferred to an external camp in Weimar. He performed forced labour at the Saukelwerks nearby, and then was finally released entirely. He was assigned to serve in the Waffen-SS formation, which is a penal, the Dielwanger formation, which is a penal battalion. Entry to the Dielwanger battalion was voluntary. The curious logic that was put forward by the SS, and particularly by Oskar Dielwanger, who himself was a habitual criminal, was that the political prisoners should be recruited to this SS battalion because they were people with real strength of character, is the inference. It was really a way of escaping concentration camp existence. The recruits were taken to Krakow, where they were trained lightly. And they were obviously being prepared to face the onslaught of the Red Army. They were deployed in Belarus, fighting the partisans there, and it was estimated that the formations killed probably about 30,000 civilians there. And then they were taken to Warsaw to put down the Warsaw Uprising. Quite what happened to Otto is unclear. He never returned home. He was pronounced legally dead in 1951 by his widow. He may have been killed by the SS. He may have been killed by the Soviets. He may have died in another way. But he never returned home. So it's a curious irony, in a way, that both brothers wound up in the SS through radically different routes. Following Hitler's suicide, Thilbert remains loyal to the regime and loyal to Hitler, and is able to evade occupying forces following the end of the war. The British and the Americans were active in looking for him, and he had several false IDs, changed his name to Alfred Selbert, and there was a kind of a detailed intelligence file from the US Army, knowing exactly who to look for. He sank back into the anonymity of civilian life along with his family. And this lasts until 1959, when he is arrested by the West German police, along with other members of his Einsatzkommando. He was sentenced for the murder of 18,000 Jews in the Soviet Union, and he was given a life prison sentence. He doesn't serve all of this by any stretch of the imagination. And it was at this point that he met with Henry Dix, the psychologist I mentioned earlier. One of the conclusions that Dix had was, he said, "At no time did I feel that I was conversing with an educated or cultivated person. He had never been anything other than a limited, lower middle class, status and promotion seeking Philistine, with a good boy underling mentality. His cold, inhuman eyes, that wept only for himself, were an accurate pointer to his psychological makeup." There's very interesting, I mentioned Gita Sereni earlier on, there's a very interesting interview she did with Franz Stangl, the commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka, and she says something quite similar. There was this kind of quite unremarkable, quite banal, silly little man, really. It's this trivial trivial little man who was interested in timetables and uniforms and rules and things being done properly, and was quite unaware really of the gravity of anything he'd done. And there's a fascinating story here of things as banal as advancement and careerism, and a desire to please, to impress, to be seen as being validated by the senior leadership. There is an interesting little postscript to this story where Filbert, who was released early, went on to be to feature in a film as an SS killer, ironically. And there are all sorts of lovely little details that Alex has put in this book about his time in Stammheim prison, at the same time that the Baader Meinhof gang, the Red Army faction, were in prison there. Is in 1975, when Filbert was released, the facility containing the Red Army faction was created. Filbert implies in an interview later on that he may well have had some role in the death of Ulrich Meinhof, who the record shows committed suicide in the prison. But again, he's something of an unreliable witness. We don't know whether he was saying things to impress and to please, and to puff himself up rather. The director of the film that Filbert starred in, Thomas Harlan, presented a fairly plausible theory that Andreas Baader was murdered in prison as opposed to shot himself, which is supposedly the theory. And Thomas Harlan also investigated in the film that he made with Filbert, Wunderkanal, the legacy of Nazis who had gone silent and assimilated themselves into the society of the Federal Republic of Germany. One of the great issues of post-war Germany. Anyway, I've gone on for far too long. This is an excellent book. It is a fascinating journey through 20th century German history, through the Weimar, the Nazi, and the post-war period, through the story of Albert Filbert, and the questions of complicity, of motivation, of his punishment, and his, to some extent, rehabilitation in the German society, really are massive issues that hang over 20th century German history. So this book is a great way of investigating 20th century German history through the eyes of one particularly morally tainted individual and his rather unfortunate brother. Anyway, I'm going to be coming back later in the week with a regular podcast on a different topic of history. So I hope you enjoyed this, and do go out and buy the book. I'm going to put the link to the book underneath this podcast. It's really great. Try whenever you can. Please get this either direct from the publishers or get it from an independent bookshop. Support these guys, because if we don't, they will be gone. There will be nothing more. Anyway, speech over, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. Bye-bye.